In today's episode, we're going to be talking about the behavior of avoidance. But before I jump into that, please, if you enjoy this channel, I would love for you to subscribe so that you can have a notification go off anytime that I post a new video. I usually try to post a video every other week so that you get some sort of a new information or some sort of explanation about or better understanding of what OCD actually is, how it works, different symptoms, how to recognize it, and tidbits from interviews that I've conducted with other professionals in the field, and general educational knowledge from me. And I'm somebody who happens to have OCD, and I also specialize in OCD and anxiety disorders, and I'm licensed as a therapist in the state of California. So one of the things before we dive into talking a little bit about avoidance is, people oftentimes say things like, oh my gosh, I'm so OCD. Oh, we all have OCD. And, maybe it sounds like it's a cool fad or it's like, thing to have or to be or whatever it is. But the fact is that it really isn't something that everybody has, and it's not usually something that a person with OCD will say, oh yeah, I'm so OCD about this. OCD is an anxiety producing experience. It triggers anxiety, feelings of guilt, shame, embarrassment. I've yet to meet a person with OCD who will say like, oh yeah, I love having my OCD experience. So, what isn't OCD, usually when people say things like, oh yeah, I love to keep my things clean, that's not OCD. I love to keep my things lined up. That's not OCD. Or I love to arrange things in this one certain way. That's not OCD. OCD is a very debilitating disorder. It's on a spectrum really from mild, moderate to severe. So on the milder end, it might feel like I'm needing to do things because I just need them a certain way, or I might be repeating certain things because I feel like it just makes me feel a little bit better. It kind of reduces maybe some of my discomfort or anxiety even. On the moderate to severe, it becomes much more clear that a person really feels really driven to perform the repetitive behaviors because they're having this internal experience where they're having these intrusive thoughts that pop in their head without their control, where it's constantly triggering their anxiety center, the alarm center of their brain, the fight and flight response. And so they're constantly in the state of being unsure if what their brain is telling them is true or not. So, all of us basically actually have intrusive thoughts. That's a very normal, common human phenomena. It's just in the OCD brain, essentially the brain is not filtering properly. So it's not categorizing properly that something in fact is perhaps low level threat, not that big a deal, and to toss it. And so for the OCD person, it gets really difficult to recognize if in fact something is threatening or not, or what's the level of danger. Could this really possibly maybe actually happen? And so a person with OCD can recognize that, yes, maybe my thoughts are really catastrophic, or maybe they might not be true, but it could be. And what if it is? But what if even that 1% could happen? And the reason people get really hyper-focused on that small percentage of the possibility that something could happen is because, again, internally, they're having this experience where their internal alarm system is constantly being rung, right? It's constantly going off. So you can imagine if you have your fight and flight response always turning on, it's not going to be a pleasant experience. So for folks who say, oh my gosh, I'm so OCD, I love to keep things clean, or oh my gosh, I'm so OCD, I love to keep my stuff organized, that's not OCD. That's a preference. You like it, you enjoy it. That's great. A person with OCD, not one person that I've ever worked with or talked with will say that I love this experience. It's extremely anxiety producing. Some folks can have feelings of guilt, shame, embarrassment. You can have panic attacks. Oftentimes people have some depression. You can feel kind of out of body. It's very time consuming, especially when it gets much more intensive, like moderate or severe level of intensity. So it's just something to be aware of when we're talking about this anxiety disorder, that it's really not, it's not a preference. It's really, there's something happening internally in the brain circuitry, and it's causing a really intense amount of distress. So with that, let's get into the conversation today. So, one of the distinctions I think is really important to learn to make is, like any behavior, right? there's a certain amount that when we engage in a certain behavior, it can be really healthy. Like there can be such a thing as healthy avoidance as a way perhaps to set a boundary, but that's different than when we're avoiding because of our OCD brain. And so that's what we're going to dive into a little bit more today. So let's talk about healthy avoidance. Healthy avoidance. So I have some examples. So healthy avoidance, for example, if you had an argument with a loved one, a friend, a parent, anybody, after an argument, it actually can be healthy to avoid engaging immediately in some other conversation because you're still kind of elevated. So it's better to take space and actually perhaps even like a little timeout up to at least half an hour so that you give your body, your physiology a chance to cool down just enough so you can start to think a little more clearly, so that you can start to perceive things a little bit more as they actually are versus out of that emotional place. So when there's a fight and there can be some anger or hurt or frustration or feeling misunderstood, oftentimes avoiding having a conversation right after a fight is actually a good thing. It can be healthy. You don't want to avoid, obviously, indefinitely, but creating some space and taking some space is actually a healthy strategy. And once you've taken a little bit of space and you feel like you've got a little more control over yourself, then it's a great time to re-engage again and kind of and ask, check in with the other person. Hey, are you open and ready to talk about things? And then you could both sit down and actually discuss things. Another example of healthy avoidance might be that you set a boundary with someone and then you're reinforcing it because you're going to avoid getting into the same patterns. So perhaps you've set a boundary that, there's a certain conversation, let's say you see that you constantly have with a person and you notice that they just keep wanting to have that conversation. And you might say, hey, I don't want to keep talking about this. This is not really relevant or useful. This is not healthy. I don't want to have this kind of thing that we get into again because it never really, ends well. So I'd like to avoid that. And I'd like to make sure that we actually engage in a way that's really productive and, we respect each other's boundary and preference. And let's say then the pattern comes up again. So it will be okay in that moment to say, hey, I kind of let you know I don't want to do this. And here we are again. So, I'm going to actually step back for now. So avoiding jumping or getting caught in the same pattern would actually be a healthy strategy at the time. Now, even as I'm saying this, I imagine if you're listening, you might for a minute maybe think, oh, maybe there's other words we can use like boundary or taking space. And we can, but if we're creating a boundary or taking space, we're then also avoiding and not engaging in the things that we might, like if I'm not taking space or avoiding, then that means I'm engaging in a fight, let's say, right? So I want you to, as you're listening, really stay open to the language and the words and understand the concept that I'm teaching on today and talking to you about. So really want you to globally just understand not engaging in something or avoiding something doesn't always have to be a negative, right? So the last kind of example I have is increasing your self-awareness to avoid same pitfalls. So that's a healthy avoidance, right? Because when you become a lot more self-aware and you learn different aspects about yourself and why you do what you do, or why maybe you've done something in the past and then things start to make sense again, it really helps you then to learn something new and useful that you can actually implement so that next time you can already see when and where there might be that pitfall coming and you can avoid it, right? So you don't have to step right into the same muck and mire. You can actually make a different choice and you can sidestep and not have to get into the same kind of place that you've been at before. And that's a great thing because that means you're growing, you're learning, and we want that. That's actually great for humans. So now let's talk about OCD avoidance. So here's a distinction. With OCD, a person might want to avoid because they're really feeling anxious. And so when we're feeling really anxious and that state, that emotional state is up and pretty high in our system, it's actually really hard to also think and perceive things accurately. So when you're having a heightened state of arousal and you're feeling anxious or guilty or ashamed or embarrassed, you cannot perceive things clearly. So you're going to perceive some event as potentially a threat. And so you're going to think, I must avoid, abandon, run, flee. So this is where this avoidance now is not really a healthy adaptive pattern. It's something you're doing out of the state of anxiety, which leads me to this next point where you learned that avoidance is the only way to stay safe. So what you're learning by avoiding because you're feeling anxious or guilty or embarrassed is that one, you can't tolerate anxiety, so I must avoid. And two, you learn that avoidance is the only way that I can then make sure I am actually okay. When the fact is, if you're doing that, you're actually reinforcing the very cycle you're trying to break, because all you're doing is teaching your brain that I not only cannot handle it, but I also then don't get a chance to learn anything new. I literally am just going to constantly run away and shut down and flee and stay away from things. And the more you do that, the smaller your world gets. And those listening and those who have OCD, I know you know what I'm talking about. I've been pretty open about the fact that I have OCD. I also specialize in OCD and anxiety disorders. So time and time again, when I see people constantly avoiding, it just breeds more avoidant behaviors. And the more a person avoids, the more they really lose their freedom. And now they really become constricted because their OCD brain is really running rampant and taking charge of their life, which is, of course, not what anybody wants. And lastly, avoidance of intrusive thoughts leads to thought suppression, which leads to more intrusive thoughts. So it's this cycle of when I'm trying to avoid these thoughts that are kind of, popping in my head, then what do I want to do after that? Well, if I'm avoiding them, that means I'm telling myself that just even having those thoughts is dangerous. So now I'm going to start to develop this belief that just the sheer fact I'm having these intrusive thoughts or images or sensations is dangerous. Now I'm going to develop a belief that just the sheer fact that I have these feelings of anxiety and guilt and shame, that those are dangerous. And so in that way, the brain is going to now create that association. And next thing you know, what's going to happen? Well, you're going to have more of those thoughts because the brain is in this weird way trying to keep you safe. So it thinks, oh, since you're reacting, then there must be a threat. So let's produce more of that kind of trigger, more of that thought, because we're really trying to keep you safe. But it's really this counterproductive process that's happening in the OCD brain. OCD is really quite fascinating because it's really counterintuitive in terms of how you need to work with yourself and what you need to do to get better. So what I want you to really walk away from today and understand is that when you're avoiding something, not because it's actually driven by because I set a healthy boundary and I'm actually practicing, that, self-love or self-compassion by following through with my boundary, or because this is actually right now a healthy time to, avoid any conversation and take some space. If you're not doing that and you're avoiding, having thoughts or uncomfortable feelings because you're having an OCD episode, all you're really doing with that behavior is basically reinforcing the very cycle. So one of I believe it was the last episode where I talked about the OCD anxiety cycle. So you might want to check out that video so you can learn a little bit more about how the cycle works. So avoidance is just one of those behaviors that really commonly gets missed in folks with OCD, where they might not realize that, oh, that's actually a compulsive behavior. So you've now learned a little bit about the difference, but also please know if you are avoiding, you're probably compulsively avoiding. You're feeling an urge to continue to avoid. So if I were you, I would definitely take a look at your own behaviors and kind of, how are you avoiding things and why are you avoiding things? Thanks for listening. See you in the next one.